Hello everyone. Thank you for coming out this afternoon and welcome to the Melbourne International Film Festival Talking Pictures session on virtual reality and storytelling, which is being presented in partnership with the Wheeler Centre. My name is Katie Morrison. I am the co-founder of Vertov. We're a storytelling virtual reality studio based here in Melbourne, and I will be your host for this afternoon. So we are here today to talk about a medium that's been described as a new frontier in storytelling. Some people say it's a place where the old rules don't necessarily apply, where we might have to reimagine what it is to be a director or an audience. A medium that's built on cutting-edge technology, but where the rules of the story are still being worked out. Since Facebook invested $2 billion in what was at the time a Kickstarter-backed operation run out of a garage by a 22-year-old, in 2014, virtual reality has also been talked about as the next big entertainment platform. So it's no coincidence, perhaps, that one of VR's emerging leading directors is also one of Hollywood's most experienced storytellers. I'm here with a man who has spent the last 25 years as a computer animation director, a screenwriter, a story artist, a film director, and an executive producer. He directed Dreamworks Animation's very first animated feature film, Antz, and he was a director and screenwriter on all 4 Madagascar films in the franchise, which together grossed more than $2.5 billion at the box office.
I didn't see any of that.
You could have bought Oculus Rift. He's now the chief creative officer at Baobab Studios and the director and writer of the VR experience Invasion, which is starring Ethan Hawke and is currently screening in the VR showcase here at MIFF. So please welcome Eric Darnell. Thank you for coming all this way, Eric, from LA as well.
Oh, my pleasure. It's been great.
Yeah. So I wanted to start off by saying that you've had such a long career in feature animation, and you have obviously helmed such amazingly successful films. And so I was wondering if, I was thinking that maybe to some, a pivot towards such an emerging, undefined medium might seem like a bit of a surprising choice. But I believe that when we were talking earlier, you were saying the starting point in your career was actually an interest in experimental animation, and that's kind of how you got into your role in Dreamworks. So I wondered if you could kind of start off by telling us a little bit about your journey from into what happened to end up being Madagascar.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the middle of the country of the United States, in Kansas, in Prairie Village, Kansas, of all places. Which is a suburb of Kansas City, really. It's not quite as rustic as it sounds. And my father was a doctor, and I had no imagination, so I thought that's what I was going to be. I went to a public college, University of Colorado, and was growing up at the time and sort of realized that I could actually decide that I could be something else than that. And I always liked to write, so I picked journalism, actually. And it was broadcast journalism, but everybody that was in the broadcast journalism school wanted to be the guy on TV, and that's the news. And I was more interested in how do you put a news story together? How do you shoot a news story? And then I kind of realized that what I really had was an interest in filmmaking. So I started taking classes in the film school and was particularly inspired by this filmmaker named Stan Brackish, who is kind of one of the most influential and least known avant-garde or experimental filmmakers of the 20th century. But he was so passionate about what he did, and I couldn't believe that a grown man could have this passion for what, until then, I'd sort of thought as something sort of trivial. And he was a real inspiration. So by the time I graduated with my degree in journalism, I was ready to go live in a mud hut and be an experimental filmmaker for the rest of my life. And that's kind of what I did for several years until I made enough money waiting tables and construction to go into grad school and at California Institute of the Arts. And I enrolled in their MFA program in experimental animation. And computers were experimental at that time. This is the late 80s. And so I got into the computer there. And when I graduated, I found a job at Pacific Data Images, which was the oldest computer animation company in existence at that time, around 1990, 91. And fortunately, the people that were there were really interested in storytelling, but unfortunately, the world wasn't ready for that yet, not from computer animators. So we spent a lot of time morphing the front end of the 1990 Ford pickup into the front end of the 91 Ford pickup. Like, wow, look at that. The blinker lamp is over there now. I got to get one of those. But finally, Dreamworks was really interested. They formed in '95 and were interested in developing computer animated feature films and recognized the value of PDI. Ended up partnering with PDI and ultimately owning PDI. And I was lucky enough to be picked to be one of the folks to develop Antz. And at the time, there wasn't really anybody that had made a computer animated film except John Lasseter. Toy Story had just come out. He was busy, so I was lucky enough to get that job. And that sort of, from there, as Katie said, I went on for the next over 20 years or so, developing and writing and directing computer animated feature films. And then about a year and a half ago, I'd finished with the Penguins of Madagascar, and Dreamworks was consolidating down to Glendale, California, and I didn't really want to move down to Southern California. And so I stepped away from Dreamworks, and then I met this woman, Maureen Fan, a Harvard Business School grad who was a VP at Zynga, and she'd always wanted to start an animation company. And she said, do you want to do that too? And she put a headset on me, the first time I'd put a VR headset on, and I was blown away. And so I said yes, and that was 18 months ago. We were funded last summer, and Invasion was our first release.
And we've got a clip of Invasion to show, and I won't go to it straight away because I just wanted to pick up on something that you said there, that was the first time that you put a VR headset on and that you were blown away. That's not the first time you'd seen VR, though, is it? Because I think that you came across it in the 90s.
That's true. In the 90s at PDI, some of the smart guys strapped a huge Silicon Graphics computer to the back of a wheelchair in a backpack, and found the smallest TVs basically that they could, and made their own headset. So that was the first VR experience. It was like wireframe world. Somebody push you around in a wheelchair. Other people would be wrangling, a dozen cables, and clearly it wasn't ready for prime time. But the interest has been there for decades, and I think now, not only with the work that that Facebook has done, but just the fact that that there are several billion smartphones out there in the world, and they're actually really powerful compared to what a phone could do 20 years ago. That there's finally a potential market, and it's amazing the experience. I don't know how many of you have tried VR yet. Could you raise your hand if you've tried it? So look at that, a lot of people. So and probably a lot of you, your first experience was Google Cardboard or maybe a Samsung Gear VR. But even in that context, the relatively inexpensive version, it's a pretty cool experience. It's like really cool. So that got me excited. And it seemed like it's going to happen now.
Yeah. And so you went on to creating Baobab then. What was your focus when you were setting up the company? What were you thinking that, okay, we've got this new medium, it's very exciting, I remember it from the 90s, I've been blown away by it now. What did you want to do with it?
Well, of course, my history has been in telling stories. And, I'm asked an awful lot, well, what does a director do in computer animation? And really, we do the same thing that a director in any film format does, live action or anything. We're really the caretakers of the story. We work with the writers, or we write ourselves. We direct the actors for the vocal performance. We direct the animators for the physical performance. We're working with cinematographers. We're working with composers for them. I mean, every department kind of has to filter through the director, and what the director is doing every time they're making a decision is thinking about story. Should this be blue or red? There is a way you can find an answer to that question by looking at the story. All these people are incredibly talented that work on making these feature films, and they could all do great work on their own. But My job is to make sure that at the end of the day, we're all on that hill over there, you know? They could all fan out and do beautiful work, but if they're not all focused on the same goal, which is having a great story, telling it well with characters that you can fall in love with, then you don't end up with something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And the director's role then is to be a constant sort of story anchor. So that's my background. And fortunately, that's what Maureen was interested in doing too, which is entertainment, storytelling, great characters, and just delighting audiences, and then seeing what we could do with virtual reality that you can't do with other medium that would help us tell that story. But you see a lot of, and I'm not saying this is a negative thing, but you see a lot of work in VR that is kind of like a tech demo, like, look, you can fly a plane, or et cetera.
The roller coaster.
The roller coaster, the ubiquitous roller coaster ride. Yeah, and but we always want to have story at the top. That's the most important thing. If that means we have less interactivity, that's okay for us, because at the end of the day, we want people to come out of that VR experience having fallen in love, hopefully, with a character or being moved by a story, and not just a gee whiz factor. And as we all get more savvy with this medium, the gee whiz stuff is not going to be nearly as valuable as it is today. And people are going to be looking for stuff that has depth and has value that transcends just the wow, look where I am thing that actually kind of works right now for people.
So maybe because I have just left the clicker to show you the slides over there. So while I'm walking over the stage to get that, maybe you could set up Invasion for us and tell us a little bit about what it is.
Okay, so Invasion is a VR, I hate to say movie, but it's not a movie, in fact. But what you're going to see here is a movie. This is cinema with a single camera, with a cinematographer that's deciding what you're going to look at. So there's nothing new there. But imagine that if you were seeing this with a VR headset on, everywhere you looked, you could see this snowy landscape. The snow's falling all around you. Everything is in 3 dimensions, and you are out on that lake. If you were watching this on one of the higher-end headsets, like the Oculus headset or the HTC Vive, when you look down, you would see that you have a body of a little white bunny. It would follow you around as you moved. If you squatted, your little bunny belly comes out. And so anyway, this is a section, this is sort of the center and main section of Invasion. I think it lasts about 4 minutes or so. Actually, this is an even shorter version. So that hawk had it coming, by the way. He tried to kill the bunny earlier, so he deserves to die.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about what the inspiration was for this particular piece? Like why this piece above others for your first foray into VR?
Well, you know, I'm kind of a science fiction fan, and I was watching for the umpteenth time the original War of the Worlds movie, and you know, it just kind of struck me like, you know, this advanced technology, you know, clearly, you know, this vast intelligence, and you know, you all know how the story ends. It's sort of Deus ex machina, you know. It just doesn't matter what the people or the hero or anybody does. It's just biology, you know. Microbes kill the aliens. And you know, it's like really, they're really bumblers, you know. Despite everything, they just really didn't really have their act together. So I thought it'd be fun to take that sort of to the nth degree. And so you have these aliens that come down to take over the planet, and the one thing they fail to account for is the power of the little white bunny. So, as you see as the story unfolds.
Yeah, so you started very much from a story perspective, even from a story that you actually knew quite well. Were there things about that particular story that you thought were lending themselves to this medium in particular, or was it just something fun to explore?
For me, it's just, first and foremost, it's finding a story that, you know, that grabs me. Mm-hmm. And then from there became the work of figuring out, well, how do you do this in this brand new medium where I can't do, or it's, maybe I can, maybe I can't, but you know, I figured if you're a character out on that ice, I can't do the typical things I do, where I figure out how to compose a shot, I direct the audience's eye across a cut to what I want them to see next, and you know, in this particular example, it didn't make sense to cut, because essentially when you're there in that world, when you do that, you're teleporting your viewer to another place in the environment, and that's just not something that bunnies know how to do yet. So yeah, you have to start thinking about it in a different way, and if in fact we'd made the version of the story that I had originally envisioned, it would have really failed miserably, because once we got into this new medium that nobody really knows what are the tools in our toolkit, how do you tell a story, we discovered a lot of things, especially by showing it to people while we were working in progress. Overall, we showed it to over 1,500 fresh sets of eyeballs, and made a lot of changes based upon how people were reacting. You know, the last thing I want is for audiences to be watching, you know, the wind blow through the trees or the clouds roll by when there's an important narrative moment happening. So a lot of it is figuring out how to inspire the viewer to make that free choice that they have to look where I want them to look when I want them to look there.
Yeah, so that's very interesting, because there's a lot of conversation about exactly how you do those things. And there are for a medium that is claiming to have no rules at the moment, there are lots of people saying that there are lots of rules that we have to avoid breaking. So I wonder what you think about some of those things, like you cannot cut in VR. Like, do you subscribe to those tenets, or do you go about testing them?
Yeah, you know, I take all of that stuff with a grain of salt. There's a lot of people out there who like to imagine or believe that they've already figured it all out. And some people who are even more interested in writing the manifesto than actually creating anything in VR. Especially when people are saying, here's some things that you should never do, or here's some things that you can't do. You know, the history of the human race is strewn with the dead bodies of people who have told other people what they can't do, right? And then been proven wrong. And so, I think it's best to keep an open mind about that sort of thing. So, yeah, one of the things is, oh, you can't cut in VR. Well, I was watching a concert in VR, and there was a cut, and I didn't even realize it until a few seconds later. Wait a minute, they just cut there. They did a cut. You're not supposed to do that. But, you know, it's all about context, and a lot of times that can work really well. And even inside a VR story, John Carmack came up with this idea of teleporting, and that's a way to move yourself around an environment. And he did it in a science fiction context, like that's a power that you have. This is a game that he's working on called Bullet Train, and it works great, you know. And then people said, oh, teleporting, okay, let's do that here too. And then suddenly there's a scenario that has nothing to do with sci-fi or high-tech or anything else, and yet teleporting is the way you get around. And after, doing it a couple times, it just becomes second nature and you don't even think about it. And of course, teleporting is essentially cutting, right? Suddenly you appear somewhere else. And there's a lot of other things I've heard, like any sound, like music, for example, shouldn't just exist in your head. It should exist, somehow should be coming from the world around you. Well, it's really cool when you do that, but we kind of really quickly discovered that in our case, we didn't need to do that. So we just did a stereo mix for the music, and it just follows your head wherever you go. It doesn't exist out in the world. And in fact, Scott Stafford, who helped us with the music on Invasion, has also worked on a lot of the Google Spotlight Stories pieces. And he found that not just a stereo mix, but a really tight stereo mix for the music works really well. So before Scott came along, I had taken all the stems, or essentially the different tracks, different instruments, and spread them in a circle around the viewer based upon this guy who said you must put every sound in the environment. And it sounded really cool. The violins were over here, the percussion was there, the keyboard was there, the strings are behind or whatever, and it just became like really distracting. You turn your head and suddenly the strings are in this ear and then they're in that ear, and you start going, well, where's the orchestra? And so that's another example. A lot of people I've heard that, like, if you're going to do physics, that because we know physics so well intuitively, that anything that exists in an immersive VR landscape, the physics should be spot on. Otherwise, it will kick people out because they'll recognize that it's not realistic physics. Well, cartoon animation is all about exaggeration, and we all know what that looks like. And nobody's told me that, that the blue aliens seem fake. I mean, they're obviously fake, but so there's just a lot of people have these very strong opinions, and sometimes I think if we listen to those things too much, that it almost limits our ability to be creative and to be adventurous and just go try something, try stuff. So I just encourage people to think about, especially VR makers, to just try it, and you'll find out whether it works. And it may work in one context and not another. There was one person that said, well, we had a story that we thought was funny. We did some storyboards, and we thought the storyboards were funny. And then we did the VR piece, and we thought that was funny. And then we showed it to audiences, and nobody laughed. So what we learned was, you can't do comedy in VR. If it's funny in VR, it's funny, right? So a lot of times people will take their own experience and then turn that into an absolute. But I understand, we all have so little experience in this medium. But I think, just be humble. Say, well, maybe it wasn't funny, and then go figure out how to make it funny.
And how do you deal with the idea that that in this particular medium, the user or the viewer becomes a character? You've obviously characterized them as a bunny as well in this piece, but do you think that's an intrinsic part of what we need to do to really create presence in VR?
That's the only way you can do it. No.
It's a rule now.
No, I think for me, it's a really interesting avenue for storytelling. I mean, I have ideas for other stories where you are just essentially a fly on the wall or a ghost. Where essentially you're an audience member who has been taken out of their seat and put on the stage of that play, and the play is actually not on the stage, but it's on location, and so essentially you're just there and it's happening around you, and I think that's a valid way to go, of course. But what I'm really interested in is, and this is one thing that I think VR can do in a way that no other storytelling medium could do as well, is to take the viewer out of that seat and put them into the world of the story, and then give them the opportunity to be a part of the story. And it's interesting watching how people react to Invasion, especially the ones that are uninhibited. Some people put that headset on and go, I look like a dork. Everybody thinks I look so dorky right now. And they become very sort of tight and don't really give themselves up to the experience. But for those that do, like when that bunny comes out of the rocks and hops over and looks them in the eye, they're often really delighted by that. There's something magical that's happening when you're in this world with a character, and the character recognizes that you're there and acknowledges your presence. And it's not anything like when a character in theater or film breaks the fourth wall and looks out at the audience or looks at the camera, and you kind of know that's, quote, fake. But when you're there in the world, it's really compelling. It's the kind of communication that we're all used to, direct eye contact. And it means something very different than when you're watching a film. And as we get better at it, and as we get better AI, and we can have characters actually respond to what the viewer's doing, and you get that sort of feedback loop going, then I think we're going to have the potential for even more powerful connections between the viewer and the story / characters in the story. When you think about like going to a movie and you sit in this dark room and you look at, the screen into a world that you can never be a part of, with characters that have no idea that you even exist, and yet we all have these really profound emotional experiences. Even like a kind of like a mediocre film, like, why am I crying? This movie's so stupid, but it like gets into us somehow, and it really latches on to us emotionally, usually because we're really connecting with the character. And I hesitate to say empathy because everybody's talking about, VR is an empathy engine, and it's a buzzword that gets used over and over again. But there is something that happens in a film when we really find ourselves caring about what's going to happen next to the character. And it's not sympathy. Sympathy is, I understand that you're feeling a certain way. Empathy is, I feel the way you feel. And that's a powerful connective force between us all. And VR is particularly suited for that because you're there, and the character can really respond to you specifically as an individual. And then, who knows how far we can go with that, to give the viewer this opportunity to really connect in a way that's perhaps even more profound and more natural, because you're just doing what you naturally do, make eye contact, you're smiling, you're nodding, and just then give the viewer the possibility to be a part of the story by giving them the opportunity to take some sort of action. So, you say, well, we have that opportunity in video games already, we have for a long time. And that's absolutely true. But typically, video games are really like self-centered for the viewer. Like, you're the hero. It's your story. These are choices you have to make to get to the next level or to win the game. And it's, a lot of times the connections that you have with other characters are more about getting information that you need to solve a puzzle or again, get to the next level or whatever. And there are a few games that do story really well, where you do really care about the characters, and the gameplay and the connection with the characters is really well integrated. It still tends to be like an ego-driven sort of thing, where ultimately you are the one that's going to do what has to happen to save the day or whatever the plot is. But what I'm really interested in VR is having a connection with the character in the story that is so strong that when you're given the opportunity to act, the kind of action that you're taking isn't about killing zombies, rescuing the damsel, but it's an act of compassion based upon the connection that you have with the character. You recognize what that character wants, or perhaps more importantly, what they need, even if they don't realize it. And then you're given an opportunity to take some kind of action to help them get to their goal or get to the next step or find out what they need. And that way, the viewer is really then connected with the story. And the story can take place sort of independent in a sense of what any particular viewer might do. I know that's not completely clear, but I'm not talking about branching stories where for me, it's hard enough to tell one story really well. That's why it takes 3 to 5 years to make a computer animated feature film, or any animated feature film for that matter. But if there's a way to sort of have that great story and then allow the viewer to sort of dip in and become a part of it and sort of ride that story wave and feel like their actions are contributing to it. That is the goal for me. And I'll give you an example. Really, it's the sidekick, right? I don't remember the name of Don Quixote's helper guy, but I do remember the name of Frodo's, and that's Sam, right? We all know Sam. And, he makes first breakfast and second breakfast, and he carries a big pack, and Frodo doesn't carry anything. And it's like, come on. But, and Frodo's the hero and all that good stuff. But there's many moments in that story where if Sam wasn't there, Frodo wouldn't have made it to Mordor. But he's definitely the sidekick, and he's definitely there sort of helping Frodo along, and Frodo's the hero. And I haven't checked this. I assume it's correct. But in the third book, the last scene in the book is Sam at his house with his family. He's back in, Hobbit land, Hobbit Town. And that's how the book ends. You see Sam, everything's going to be fine. He's got a great life, loving wife, a bunch of kids, everything. And that's how the whole thing ends. And then I found something as I was doing some research, and somebody had actually asked Tolkien about this. Why did you end with Sam? And he said, well, because Sam is the main character. So that's a good enough reason for me to focus on letting the viewer be the sidekick.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I'm interested in what you're saying about game design or the games field, perhaps tapping into these same ideas in a different way. Do you structure your team with people from the games industry and people from the animation industry? Can you talk us a bit about, how you put a team together to make something like this? Absolutely.
I mean, in computer animation filmmaking, you need, your great artists, 2D, 3D, and you need your rocket scientists. And we had some literal rocket scientists who had quit their job at Rocket Scientry and said, I want to do something more fun, and came to work with us. And you really need that. You need to be firing on both of those cylinders to do the work at hand. And but the rocket scientists at DreamWorks are not focused on real-time rendering. If it takes us like 11 hours to generate a frame for a feature film, that's kind of normal in a way, and not a big deal if it takes even more time. But for real-time stuff, like on the Oculus headset or the Vive headset, we have to do the same thing in 11 milliseconds, twice, once for each eye. So that's a lot of data pumping through what can be a pretty small pipe. And so for that reason, if no other, but there are many other reasons, we have a mix of people from feature film world and from the gaming world. Because what we're trying to do is to create the highest quality, the most beautiful backgrounds, the best character animation, the kinds of things that we've always aspired to do in feature filmmaking, and to do it in real time. So there's a lot of tension between those two goals, but we're split about half and half. So, one of our lead lighters is from the gaming world, because you need to know how to light a scene beautifully and allow it to, pump out those 2 frames every 11 milliseconds. And there's tips and tricks and stuff to do all that. But what's exciting about the whole thing to me is that, and one of the reasons why I left feature filmmaking, is that it feels a lot like it did in the early days, back in the late 80s and early 90s. When it's like, a client just came in and he wants us to do a furry werewolf, and we don't even know how to do fur. And, we'll figure it out. Yay, go. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Our Gang, that black and white sort of short they'd show before the feature films, in the 30s. And it was a little bit like that. Let's put on a show. Yay. We'll go to the barn and we'll just put it on a show. And so that's really what it was like in the old days. All this naivete and just this get up and go attitude. And it feels a little bit like that right now in VR, because nobody really knows what they're doing. And there's all these challenges to solve that, in 10 years from now, they'll all be figured out. But it just feels kind of like, I don't know, the Wild West.
Did you bring a lot of your animation pipeline then over to creating this piece? We've got some pictures of some of the concept art and the environment art that we might want to have a look at just to see. Can you maybe talk us through your pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it starts the same way it does in feature filmmaking. We do concept designs, just try to get a sense, and that's a very quick way to sort of come to terms or come to an agreement on what the look could be. what's the complexity of the environment, what's the production design, color design. So there's 2 examples. We had stuff that was more dark and stormy like this, and we wanted something friendlier. So we ended up lightening things up a little bit and had a lot more this has a lot of atmospherics in it as well, but tuned our atmospherics so it was more like Jesus rays and less like this foreboding dark scary mountains. Just again, this is just one of the earliest pieces that we did. You can see these aliens don't look anything like what we ended up with. Way too scary. We needed aliens that were bumblers from the beginning, and these guys kind of creeped me out. And that's closer to that's kind of where we ended up with. This is done by Willie Real, who was our character designer. And, this is a really fun, really graphic, very simple design. You could call it cute, I suppose. And then this is sort of one of the characters, Cheese, as he sort of was realized in 3D. So the 2 aliens are called Mac and Cheese. Our lead animator, who's from Poland, one of his favorite American foods is mac and cheese, and his name is Maciek, so that it all kind of fit together.
This is our main character, the bunny.
Yeah, the bunny, early design. I mean, this is really super cute, and we ended up making him white, but again, Willie did a great job in sort of establishing the tone. I don't think we really hit it like Willie did, but here's kind of a rough version of our bunny then in the environment. Big eyes, big, black pools of cuteness. And then where does it go from there?
That's it.
Okay. But yeah, we start the same way you would. We do art. I wrote a script like I would, any script. One thing I tend to do with the script is I write it. I just write it from the first person perspective, rather than sort of a third person narrative. It sort of will start like, fade up. You find yourself on a frozen lake. Everywhere you look, the snow is falling. There's beautiful mountains in the distance, and aspens and pine trees line the islands at the edge of the lake. And, stuff like that. You hear a sound, you turn, you see a bunny come out from the rocks. She looks at So trying to get sort of close to, on the page, what the experience for the viewer would be like. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting to me the way that you've characterized these bunnies, because I know watching Invasion, I feel very strongly towards this little bunny that's in front of me, and it is the visual characterization. It's the big eyes, and it's so cute, and it looks at you and it sniffs you. Did you go through a process of testing those things with audiences and seeing, how and it's very similar to traditional animation, but I feel like in VR there might be something that you need to kind of tap into and exploit there in terms of eye contact, especially making the eyes a feature of the characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first bunny that we designed was not nearly as inviting and compelling and cute as the one that we ended up with. We wished that we could have figured out how to do fur. We didn't get that figured out in time. But we did do some sort of roughening up of her texture so that she at least had a soft feel to her. The bunny that we ended up with has more of an iris. I think the original bunny just had just kind of this big pupil. But and highlights in the eyes. All these little details are really important to sort of bringing life to a character. And either now or later, I think there's an earlier piece that we have where you can sort of see the difference. But
is it the next one? I don't
know.
Where the bunny comes up and sniffs you?
Oh, this is later, but just to... This is that moment, this is closer to the final bunny, but it's that moment that audiences really responded to, where the bunny came up and looks at them in the eye. And as soon as the audience saw that, I didn't have to worry. Everybody is just glued to that bunny, and hardly anybody looks away, which I think is one of the powers of VR in that respect. And people were, like I said, they were delighted. Some people even, like, how the bunny goes down to play. Some people sort of just did that first before the bunny did that. And then they just freaked out when the bunny actually jumped down and play. I mean, they were ready to believe anything. They thought that the bunny was reacting to them, you know. And
How much does the bunny react to you?
the bunny looks at you. And on a higher end headset, like the Oculus or the Vive, if you move around through space when the characters are looking at you, they'll follow you around. And that's critical. And that's that and the little bunny body beneath you are the only real interactive elements that we had in the higher end versions. In the like a Gear VR headset where you're basically locked in one place, we didn't have to worry about that because you can't really do this and have any effects. So that is a complete straight ahead 360-degree 3D movie that just plays out before your eyes. And that's why it was so important to me to do what I could to compel or inspire the audience to sort of look where they needed to look to kind of keep up with the story.
So maybe we can dig into that a little bit, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, because I think people are really interested in that, and that giving over of control by directors to the audience, and conversely, how do you kind of just encourage them to do the things that you want them to do?
Yeah, it's a question you get a lot. Like, what is it like? How does it feel that you have to give control over to the audience? And I don't really think of it that way. I think of it's a different sort of problem because the audience is basically the cameraman. But I was talking to Ethan Hawke, who did the narration that is part of it that you don't see here. And, he's directed a lot of theater in New York. And he kind of did the same thing that I did with this. We talked about testing, right? Did I talk about testing? Yeah. And how, we just play it and we watch people watch it. And if they're not looking where I wish they were looking, and if enough people aren't looking where I wish they're looking at certain times, then I know that I need to go back and change something to inspire them to do what I want them to do. And Ethan Hawke was saying, I do the same thing with plays when I'm testing the plays that I'm directing. He sits up high behind the audience, and if everything's happening over here on stage and then he wants everybody to turn and look over there, if only half the heads turn, then he knows he's got to go back and make a change in his staging or his blocking or whatever, the sound, whatever it is, to get the audience to do what he needs them to do. And sometimes people hear that kind of stuff and they go, "Oh, that's not fair," or "That's selfish." You should be able to give the viewer the ability to look where they want to look, and what gives you the right to manipulate them like that? But you know what? All art is about manipulating audiences, right? I mean, it is. All films that are telling stories are manipulating you, and it's you think of manipulation as a negatively charged term perhaps, but it doesn't have to be. Storytelling is all about that. It's all about taking the viewer's emotions by the hand or whatever it is, and whatever the metaphor is, and helping them or inspiring them to feel something that they wouldn't otherwise feel. So I forgot where I started, but I think that that
I was going to ask you actually about just picking up on what you're saying about Ethan. Do you look to theater as a reference for VR?
Certainly. I look at all other medium as potential, or media as potential references for VR. And the main reason is, for me at least, is that when you look at cinema or literature, and what's the other one? Theater. They're all very different. And they all achieve results in very different ways. They each have their own set of things that they do. And what the majority of those media are also doing is serving this higher purpose, which is the storytelling, right? And the storytelling has something that's been around for thousands of years. It's something that is sort of part of what it means to be a human being. It's something that was happening, when we were around the campfire, or we're painting in the caves, talking about the hunt. And if you think about it, when people were sitting around the campfire, I'm just imagining this, and they're telling the story about the hunt that day and what happened, and the dramatic moment when Brock, or whatever his name was. Brock seems like a good name for a caveman. When he tried something new, and the elephant turned on him, and then he figured out a way to whatever, and now they're all having an elephant dinner, and it's excellent. and and all the kids are sitting around the same campfire hearing this story, and then when they go out on the hunt the next day, everybody has this new bit of knowledge about what it means to be a human being and can apply that to their lives in a way that they couldn't before because they didn't know anything about it. And so stories kind of have this function in our lives. Kenneth Burke, the literary theorist, and that sounds like I'm trying to sound really fancy, but this is the only thing I know about Kenneth Burke. He said that stories are equipment for living. That's why we need them. That's why we like them. They tell us something about what it means to be a human being, and we have evolved with them. And this is what, all the current media are all tapping into. This long history, this sort of understanding that we have without, reading literary theory or knowing why. Yeah. And so that's the same thing that we can do in VR, I believe. And again, I don't remember where I began, but I'm so happy I was able to say Kenneth Burke said.
Maybe we could go back a little bit to that idea about control and lack of. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you do go about magicking the user into looking in the right direction.
Right.
Are there techniques that you
Well,
use?
magicking is a good makeup word to launch that idea, because there is this sort of saying that magicians have that is, if you want the audience to look at something, look at it. And if you want the audience to look at you, look at the audience while you're pulling something out of your back pocket. They're looking at your eyes. And, a magician can stand in front of an audience just like you in Vegas or wherever the heck they are, and for some reason, well, there is a reason, but because of their skill, they're able to trick an entire audience of hundreds of people, and nobody sees that little thing that the magician does, that little trick that they do. And it's all about directing viewers' attention. So if look at Invasion, the bunny is the magician. The bunny comes out of those rocks and looks at you, and nobody looks away. And that's the perfect time for the tiger to come out from behind and kill you, right? But it's these kinds of interactions that are really meaningful to us. And they are actually, evolutionarily speaking, risky because of that very thing. And yet we get so much value out of that we crave that kind of eye contact. So that's one thing. And then, of course, when the bunny looks out of your field of view, then you're compelled to look where they're looking, and lo and behold, there's a spaceship to capture your attention. So that's a very simple idea, but really super powerful. And then sound is a really powerful way to help direct the viewer's attention. And it's not always realistic. There's a moment when the hawk swoops in earlier and tries to grab the bunny for lunch, and there's a hawk call coming out of, your left headphone. That's the right headphone, and you turn, and then there's a hawk coming, and we made that sound much louder than would have been natural, but it works because you don't have context. You don't know how far or close the hawk is, so we can make it louder. Then you hear the sound, you turn, you see a hawk, you've kind of already forgotten the volume level in it, but the fact that you got rewarded by looking there just spurs you on. And you can go to the water cooler later and say, well, maybe that was too loud. It's the same thing with the bunny. When at the very beginning you're just out on the ice and you hear the scraping sound, we turned it way up to help guide the viewer to look over into this little hole in the rocks, and you see the bunny is sort of digging around in the snow. So sound is really powerful, and you can't always use it the same way you would in cinema. And a good example of that is, when the ship goes behind the trees, in the version you saw, very quickly it appears above the trees over your head and flies and lands. But, coming from a filmmaking background where you have all this control and you've got control of the rectangle and exactly what's the viewer's going to be looking at, I said, well, let's build the dramatic tension. Let's keep that spaceship behind the trees, and we'll have the sound of the ship getting louder, and the music will swell, and the audience will be staring up, waiting for that inevitable moment when the ship is going to come from behind the trees. And after about 2 seconds of that, people just started going, well, where the heck is it? You know? And most people were like looking over here as the ship came over the trees, you know, and then they look back and the ship's going over there and it's landing and they're going, what's going on? And, you know, despite the fact that the sound is all spatialized and it's coming from right there, and we all saw the ship go behind that stand of aspens, you know, people will question their own senses. So I tightened it a whole lot. And, you know, I'm able to maintain the attention and the focus of the majority of the audience that way.
Yeah, so it sounds like the pacing is quite different in VR and in regular
Yeah,
film.
it can be. It can be.
Do you feel like you need to give people more time to get their, I don't know, sea legs?
You know, it's interesting because what some of the distributors are finding, and this is, I think, you know, almost all the content, certainly the narrative content, tends to be free right now. So what they're finding is when people download stuff, if there's not something to grab their attention right away, a lot of times people just go, and they move on to the next thing. And that's sort of counter to what we initially thought, which was what you just said. You got to give the audience time to like settle in and say, where am I? And look around and go, oh, wow. And, you know, but on average, I think they're finding that if there isn't something there, then something specific, that people will just drop out. I think if you paid for it, that probably wouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
So I got to get my money's worth. But right now, that tends to happen. So, you know, I think it's a combination of things that have to sort of come together as we figure out, as VR makers, you know, what we need to do to tell our stories and to keep the audiences engaged, and also audiences just getting more experience with it and understanding, you know, how to sort of consume VR. I mean, there's a lot of people that put the headset on and just do this, you know, and characters walk by and they just stare forward, you know. There was one woman that, like, you know, the spaceship would fly by like this and she'd go, you know, every single time anything went like that, you know, she'd turn the opposite way, you know. She's not built for VR, obviously.
Some people just aren't, maybe.
Right. But as you get familiar with, I mean, of course, I completely understand why people would just stare straight ahead. That's the way all entertainment has been delivered to everybody for, you know, for years, if not centuries. So to realize that you can turn, and a lot of times, you know, people put that headset on, they're looking straight ahead, and I say, you can look around, and then they're like, whoa, you know? So as audiences get more savvy and yeah, then I think we'll come together.
Yeah. Do you think as audiences get more savvy, we're going to start to see longer experiences? Because at the moment, the standard seems to be somewhere under 15 minutes, you know, 7 to 15 maybe, or maybe even shorter. Are we going to see feature-length virtual reality, do you think?
I think we will, whether we like it or not. But, you know, there's a couple reasons why we're doing short stuff. One is that computer animation is just really expensive, you know. It takes a lot of time. And the other is that, you know, it takes, like I said, 3 to 5 years to make a computer animated feature film. If we set out now to do a virtual reality feature film, you know, as I often say, it'd be like, you know, we come out of our VR cave, a VR production cave, and go, look, wheel, and everybody's flying around in jetpacks and stuff, because things are moving so quickly. So by doing stuff in really short chunks like this, we can kind of keep up with the technology. We can also take what we've learned and do it better, you know, whereas we're not locked into some concept or idea and learning all this stuff along the way and going, if we'd only thought of that before we started, this way we can take it and apply it to the next thing and the next thing. And also, I mean, honestly, the headsets just aren't that comfortable, you know. They're bulky. I run a little hot, so, you know, they're always like steaming up in there, and they're pressing against my forehead, and, you know, and if the content, frankly, is not well produced, it's really easy to make the audience feel nauseous, which often happens to me anyway. When
Well, nausea is a big question in VR. I think that that we're all, as content creators, very, very aware that we have a duty of care to our audiences, and that some people can get quite motion sick, or simulator sick is what it's called. What do you see as? I mean, obviously that comes into your user testing, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, we didn't move the camera at all, or the location of the viewer. We didn't move at all in Invasion, and basically the nausea is sort of just, it's about physiology. It's about how we're built. If you move the viewer's point of view without them actually moving, and this particularly applies to acceleration, and the greater the acceleration, the worse it gets. And acceleration includes slowing down as well as speeding up and going around corners. Whenever you're doing that to the viewer, their visual field is saying, whoa, I'm accelerating. And their inner ear is saying, no, you're not. You're just sitting here in a chair. And your brain says, uh-oh, mixed signals coming from eyes and inner ear. My body is losing its sense of balance, and I need to make them lay down so that they don't fall over and break me open. If this keeps going on, I'm just going to have to make my body throw up. Because in 99.999% of our human evolution, when those signals are crossed, it's almost always because the human has stupidly eaten something poisonous, and it's made them sick, and it's messing with their vestibular system and or their visual system, and so 99.99% of the time, the solution to that is to throw up the poison that's in your body, so it can be really tough for people when they're given that kind of experience. I knew a guy who was so excited he got the Vive, not the Vive, he got the Oculus headset, and then somebody had ported Team Fortress, which is a run-around first-person shooter game, and he said he was so thrilled. He put that headset on, and he played as hard as he could for like 40 minutes, and he took the headset off, and he ran to the bathroom and threw up, and he couldn't look at the headset for 2 weeks without getting nauseous. Because he just, he put himself in the worst possible situation. So I always encourage VR makers to be sensitive to that. Now, not everybody gets sick, and not everybody gets sick to the same degree. In fact, there was a study done at the University of Wisconsin at Madison where they put people in some pretty extreme VR situations, and then they timed how long it would take before they rip the headset off their head and go, "Get me out of here." And they found that the people that took the headset off the quickest, they tested everybody later to judge how far an object was from them when it was moving away or moving at them. And the people who had the best depth perception were the first ones to rip those headsets off. Oh. So it makes sense, because they're better at analyzing and sensing depth. They're more sensitive, and they were much easier to get sick. And then, there's some people where that doesn't matter so much, but what they discovered, at least in their study, was that implied that they did not have as good of depth perception. So, as I say, you wear that badge of honor, like, I've got really good depth perception while you're throwing up in the toilet, but I got good depth perception.
Aside from thinking about nausea and caring for people's kind of physical bodies when they are watching your content, are there other things that you think that we shouldn't be doing so much in VR, or that you were thinking about with Invasion that you wouldn't kind of necessarily, the directions that you didn't go in? I think we have a clip coming up where the bunny has a disaster.
Yeah, we did an earlier test of this idea of the whole Invasion concept, and we were prepping it for a conference, and we realized we weren't going to get done with the conference in time. So we ended up using just one alien instead of two, and then we came up with this other idea, and I think this will show you what that other idea was.
Shall we see if we can watch it?
This is the earlier bunny too, by the way. All right, so we didn't have to animate the bunny. And then it goes on from there. So we saved a lot of man hours.
What happened when you showed people that?
Well, you know, a lot of people laughed, and we started saying, maybe we should just kill the bunny, you know? People like this dark humor. And then we were showing it at some conference on the East Coast, and this woman watched the piece, and she took the headset off and said, "Oh, that was really fun. I really enjoyed it. But, you know, I don't think I'd ever show this to my 5-year-old daughter. I wouldn't want her to see that." And I said, "Oh, really? Why is that?" She goes, "Well, if we were in a movie theater and you killed the bunny, you know, the adults would laugh at the dark humor, at least some of them might, and that would lighten the load a little bit. And then my daughter could look up at me and say, 'Mommy, what happened to the bunny?' And I could tell her whatever I thought she needed to hear. But if she has that VR headset on, she's out there all by herself on that frozen lake. There's nobody to turn to. And, you know, the bunny is killed before her eyes." And she said, you know, she'd be devastated by that. You know, I think it could really damage her because there's no, you know, she can't turn to her mother and get guidance. And I thought that was like good feedback to get. We didn't kill the bunny, but it was also, I thought, really insightful and points to, you know, one of the many differences between what it means to watch something in VR and what it means to watch something at a movie theater.
We've got a couple more minutes. I wanted to ask one final question. I wanted to know what you guys have got coming up at Baobab. What's next for you?
Well, you know, one of our models is to get stuff out and see how it plays, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, you saw that much shorter piece. You know, we did like a less than 60-second piece that we used to sort of say, hey, we're here, and to show it to investors and to get funding for the company. That really that was never designed for a broader audience. And then we did a short little piece that we saw an excerpt from, and that actually played really well, and was part of the Gear VR launch, and based upon how that did and how it was accepted by many distributors, then we said, okay, this is getting some traction, and then we committed to making that 6-minute piece, and that did surprisingly well. I think a lot of the headset manufacturers imagine that sort of that narrative, less interactive kind of content would not really be what their audiences were looking for, but the numbers and the downloads proved that was not true. We were like right at the top. And so they're very eager for more content like this. And now that we know that we've created these characters, these aliens and these bunnies and this world that people really responded to well, we're creating our second piece inside of that world where we dig into a little bit deeper on what makes mac and cheese tick. And I can give you the vaguest of bits of information about that piece is that we're adding another character. And you know, one of our team members was at the grocery store. I do know a lot of grocery stores, you know, have like at least in America, I don't know what they have here, but like a little buffet area where you can go put a salad together, you know, or get some fried chicken and you know, and buy it by the weight. And
yeah, we don't have that.
Yeah. So it's like a little teeny cafeteria inside grocery stores. It's become a pretty common thing. And so there was a chalkboard display that's talked about one of their specials that day, and it was mac and cheese with peas. So the new character's name is Peas.
Well, I cannot wait to see what mac and cheese and peas
with peas
come up with. I want to thank you, Eric Darnell, for being here in Melbourne. Thank you for attending MIFF, and go and see Invasion.
Thanks for coming.